Hello everyone, and welcome back to Money, Power, Health. As I mentioned in the first episode, part of the goal of this podcast is to bear witness to some of the hidden forces that shape health and the extent to which they relate to money and power. Sometimes it can be hard to perceive, but everything from the quality of the air you're breathing to the bacterial count in your tap water or your proximity to a firearm both affects your health and is in large part a consequence of the distribution of money and power, the tension between private companies and government regulation. And that isn't just the case with the physical world. Many of us now also spend a large proportion of our lives and interact through social media. That digital world is shaped by commercial forces too. The companies that produce these platforms are sometimes incredibly large and active political players, co-designing and conducting research and engaging in corporate social responsibility efforts, including with UN organizations. Social media platforms are crucial conduits of information and networks of influence, though often in highly selective and unequal ways. These are not simply utility providers. In the case of much of social media, while the platform itself is an environment we inhabit and interact with, it's designed by a company that relies to a large extent on maximizing engagement, data collection, and ad revenue through our presence on it. There's been increasing interest in how social media algorithms may amplify or inadequately moderate harmful content, including hate speech and misinformation, or be used by harmful product manufacturers to promote their products or shape public discourse. Research is now beginning to consider the ways in which social media companies and platforms might be regarded as commercial determinants of health. I thought it would be good to devote an episode to understanding some of the health implications that arise as a result of the nature, incentives, platforms, and activities of social media companies, since they're responsible for an increasing portion of our social worlds. To do this, I've invited two guests. The first is Professor Nora Kenworthy. She's an associate professor in the School of Nursing and Health Studies at the University of Washington and has conducted a range of research projects on the health implications of crowdfunding platforms and social media more generally. Joining her is Marco Zenone, a researcher and doctoral candidate at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, whose studies focus at the intersection of public health, misinformation, and marketing on social media platforms. Nora, Marco, welcome to Money, Power, Health.
Hi, Nathan.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So, Nora, if I might start by asking you a question. So something that confuses me quite a lot is the distinction, or lack thereof, between social media, the platform, the environment, and social media, the company, the business model. I was wondering if you could help unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think there's been a bit of a deliberate move on the part of social media platforms to try and distance themselves from companies, right? So if you think about like Alpha and Google and Meta and Facebook, right? And I think that because most of us live part of our digital lives on the platforms, we don't often think as much about the companies, except for in weeks like this when, Elon Musk takes over Twitter. And, we all think about that a lot. And I think that these platforms have become a part of our sort of digital landscapes and our digital lives in really powerful ways that, we don't even think when we open up our phone and glance at, Facebook for the 50th time today or something. Or, when we don't have an awareness when we Google something and think about what's producing the search results that we receive. And so I think getting down to that deeper level of where the company is in this and where those corporate decisions are, and importantly, where the profits are coming from, right? Because it's this classic sort of commercial determinants of how follow the money. It's really hard to follow the money in this space. And so it feels very opaque when you start to really try and dig into the corporate side of platforms and social media.
Yeah, I think that's right, Nora. And actually, you referenced the example of Elon Musk. And to me, that's quite a jarring reminder of the fact that these platforms like Twitter, which I'm on most days, are not public spaces or fora that are just there as kind of utilities, but they're privately owned companies, and the shape of them can be changed dramatically when they're bought over by a new entity, by a new person who can then make unilateral decisions about something that to me is like a road I walk down every day. But actually the shape of the road, how wide it is, and where it takes me can be changed quite drastically as a result of the owner of the platform and the ways in which they choose to make revenue.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about our digital lives, like we all basically live in company towns now, that are highly controlled by corporations that are often highly controlled by individuals, right? And so if you think about digitally what a company like that owns of us, of our data, of our decision making, it's really quite incredible how much of that space is really controlled by the company itself.
Wow, just the notion of social media platforms as company towns is just quite a disturbing image for some reason. Thanks. So, linked to that, I guess, are the incentive structures that are generated by these platforms and the way in which they then shape content. And that's something I wanted to ask you about, Marco. So, influencers play a big role in determining what most people see on social media. Quite a lot of content is generated by a minority of what you might call super users. And you've been examining the ways in which these dramatically shape the content that people see, especially when it comes to things like viral campaigns, misinformation, and sponsored advertising content. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up. I think it's also remembering some of the kind of things that draw us to social media, the ability to be social, how social media for a lot of people represents the only place that they can kind of have that true agency. So I do a lot of research on TikTok, which is young people. And TikTok, for people on TikTok, large demographic is very young. And, they live at home. They might not feel like they have full control over their lives. So social media offers this kind of respite for a lot of them. So what draws them there is this agency, this ability to promote themselves, express themselves, be creative. So there's this whole positive side of what brings people to social media. And I think even in our daily lives as researchers, Twitter can be very useful, for example, or Facebook might be good to talk to our grandparents every once in a while. But at the same time, it kind of brings into what Nora said, is a lot of things that bring us onto the platforms can kind of be abused fairly easily. So with the example that you were giving of, for example, the influencer campaigns and young people wanting to be on these platforms more naturally, the kind of communities that build around certain ideas or certain lifestyles can be very easily manipulated into these kind of influencer advertising campaigns that we see. So it's a double-edged sword. The things that bring us there can also be the things that kind of lead us to be exploited in some cases.
No, definitely. I mean, speaking personally, the fact is I keep going back to Twitter and and similar platforms, and I do get a lot of really valuable information from there. And I don't really, I guess, stop to think about what information others are getting from me for, I guess, for better or for worse. And I wanted to unpick one of the things you said there, which is that it's this sort of platform that's sort of a level playing field to some degree, like that there's this sort of sense of equality that exists amongst us on these platforms, and that there's a kind of honest engagement or battle of ideas that's happening. And to get into that a little bit, because I've been really struck by some of the work that you've done, Nora, on crowdfunding and on the way in which sometimes social media can actually amplify divides that already exist between us. And because of the nature of the networks that it leverages, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. First of all, how you came across it and became interested in it, and then what your reflections are from doing research on it.
Yeah, I mean, I started with this out of pure fascination. I just kind of stumbled across, actually, one of the first crowdfunding campaigns I actually saw was a paper flyer that was posted in my neighborhood. This was back in the day when, like, if you started a GoFundMe, they gave you like a flyer to print out, and like with like the tear off tabs at the bottom. Wow. Except it would direct you to a website, right? And so I kind of just went down this rabbit hole. I was like, what is this? Who's here? Like, what's going on? And I happened to be working at the time with a media scholar, Lauren Berliner, who has been sort of steeped in these kind of influencer economies, so questions of like, what happens when people don't go viral on YouTube, for example. And she really opened the door for me to understand that there was this really rich scholarship happening, particularly led by women of color, who were writing about these steep inequities that were happening in these digital spaces that appeared egalitarian, that appeared flat, right? And so it was really reading those accounts of people like Ruha Benjamin that helped me to understand that there was a whole set of questions that we weren't asking about crowdfunding that kind of desperately needed to be answered. And that crowdfunding was a particularly interesting place to look at the ways that inequities are amplified by digital platforms. And then it was just a question of like how hard it is to figure out those questions, right? Because, you know, if you think about sort of traditional health disparities scholarship, you have to first figure out like who's in the room, right? To understand who's not in the room. And doing that on digital platforms is really difficult, partly because we don't have access to the data, and partly because it's very hard to see the whole population on any platform at any point in time.
Wow, so you're talking about a whole other side or consequence of crowdfunding where some people are able to leverage social networks around them to meet crowdfunding goals, and that's based on the level of affluence in those social networks, while others aren't. And the differences between those who can and those who can't are deeply etched along racial and ethnic lines, especially in the US. I mean, it strikes me that that represents a kind of a double burden, right? You have the knockback, the challenge of not reaching funding goals for people who nevertheless have to put themselves out there. And on the other hand, like you mentioned, you have this widening of inequalities in this way. Wow, that's really a lot to think about. What kind of recommendations can you make when you come up with a finding like that?
I mean, I think the challenge, this is particularly true with crowdfunding, but it also applies to other social media environments, is that the digital environment is amplifying existing social biases and social inequities. And some of those are very deep rooted. So like some of the research that I've done has really tried to point to the ways that crowdfunding sort of reinforces these social logics of who deserves and who doesn't, right? And like dismantling those is very difficult, right? However, I think we also need to hold these platforms accountable for the ways that they powerfully reanimate and sort of amplify these ideas and normalize them, right? So one of the things that kind of took my breath away when I started talking to people who had had very successful crowdfunding campaigns, these were people who were extremely privileged, who had all manner of sort of resources, both social and material, to kind of like help out their campaigns. And what I was hearing from them was this really powerful narrative well, I was successful in this because I'm a good person, you know, and people recognize that, you know, they were donating, but they were donating because I'm a good person. And so this conflation that happens very close together between the outcome of a campaign and how good a person is, I think that we can attribute, at least in part, to the platform and the way that it sort of creates that kind of consciousness among its users. And then I think that the other thing that, in a more kind of pragmatic policy direction, that we need to move in with platforms is simply having the kinds of data to understand questions about what role the platform plays versus what role kind of the crowd plays. You know, we still don't know any answers to questions about how GoFundMe or other crowdfunding platforms choose which campaigns to feature or which ones show up higher in their search results. And importantly, as you know, my research team has recently uncovered, which campaigns are essentially made invisible by the platform through decisions that it makes to essentially erase campaigns from the platform that it doesn't want the public to see.
One of the things that I noticed in my little corner of research on commercial actors and health is that sometimes we fail to appreciate how companies view their markets, how companies view us, and how different that is from how we view each other. And I did a lot of research on the alcohol industry, and what really struck me is looking at internal documents and how they describe their markets. They see the public in a very different way to the way we see ourselves and each other. That for them, most of their profits were coming from the top 20 to 25% of consumers, the super consumers. And those were the groups that they went back to when times were hard. Those were the groups they worried about replacing, because they made up such a big proportion of their market. And it strikes me that that's another aspect to this sort of, there's a sense that we're all equal on social media, right? But we're not. There are people with millions and millions of followers who are super, super active and who generate a huge proportion of the overall content on these sites. And then there are people who are almost invisible, whether they, either deliberately or for algorithmic reasons that we're uncertain about. And I suppose that it almost generates an interesting different power dynamic that's really hard to unpick a little bit. I wanted to maybe go back to you on that, Marco, because you've kind of done work on I guess influencer dynamics, especially on TikTok. And I wonder if you could speak to a little bit about your reflections on doing research on that platform, because as you said, you've got a huge amount of quite young users, who in some ways are at a stage in life where they are particularly susceptible to peer pressure, role models, risk-seeking behaviors, those kind of things. And then you've got these huge social media accounts, right, with like kind of massive followers. What has been your reflection on working with some of those?
Yeah, I think the idea that a few users make up the bulk of the content is quite a powerful one. And during the pandemic, we saw that just over and over again. So a really prominent example, that's not TikTok, but that was kind of close to my work, was the Great Barrington Declaration, and how there was this constant narrative there being censored, shut down, nobody was listening to their ideas. When in reality, they were speaking to the president at the time almost daily, or his team rather. But on social media as well, we saw these ideas permeate almost everywhere. And this idea of lockdowns being harmful, which we can examine. So of course there's going to be some adverse stuff that happens out of that, but on the whole, it did protect and save a lot of lives. But this idea from the Great Barrington Declaration that we can just kind of let it go everywhere and use this idea of focused protection was never going to work. But we saw that on social media permeates through daily conversations that we should be abandoning public health measures. And we just saw the complete kind of underminement of public health and public health decisions. And on social media, or in TikTok specifically, we can see similar things happen. We often hear about the influencer who's very successful, but there's a lot of people trying to be influencers who aren't successful and trying to get into that space. And it's become a bit of a profession to be an influencer now. But the majority of influencers aren't successful. In fact, they're trying very hard to compete for the market share on the platform. But yeah, I think, those few that do dominate, they hold immense power. And I think we're still kind of grappling with the power that some of these influencers have on TikTok. If you think of like the Charli D'Amelios of the world or the Addison Rays of the world, they probably have more power than the traditional celebrity, especially among young people. But I think public health, perhaps, and maybe a lot of different groups, they kind of fail to realize that still.
Yeah, I mean, that's immediately what I was thinking. As I read through some of your research on TikTok, and just the sheer number of followers, likes, interactions that you describe, I can't help but compare that to like a public health campaign or a health promotion campaign, and the scale is kind of mind-boggling. You're talking about accounts with 20, 30, 40 million followers, right? Like it's kind of incredible. And then if these challenges go viral or these videos go viral, then the spread is much, much further still. But the thing that I'm struggling with a bit is paid advertising and the relationship between that and these kind of extremely powerful influencers, because that feels like I don't know, it feels a little bit like the Wild West. I mean, are there ways in which that is regulated or controlled, or is it as Wild Westy as it currently seems?
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest issues, especially on TikTok. So there's a report that came out recently that kind of compared all these different social media platforms and kind of how transparent they were. And TikTok scored the worst across all of them. And we call this a form of dark advertising, where the only people who really know who's seeing an ad is the platform and the viewer themselves, which is quite scary when you think about the demographic that's specifically on TikTok. 60% of the people are under the age of 30. But when it comes to paid ads or influencer ads, rather, as well, for a long time, there was a lot of gray area about how you declare if something is an ad or if it's not. So a lot of the research that we have coming out kind of traced a couple of these campaigns and found that at least in 2020 and 2021, a lot of TikTok's top influencers didn't actually declare ads that were ads. It also comes down to these other issues of cross-border promotion and how we regulate that. TikTok, if you look at their policies, you can see entry advertising policies for each continent, all of these countries. And the reality is, though, you can say that that's kind of the rules. A lot of these influencers kind of transcend borders. Addison Rae, for example, isn't only famous in the United States. So how do you regulate that?
That's a really important point, Marco, and this relates back to the issue of how you regulate cross-border marketing, and social media is certainly a big part of that. And I know this is something that the WHO has looked at in relation to alcohol advertising, and it becomes really challenging, right? Because as you say, looking across borders, really the only entity that has a handle on that is the company itself. It's very hard for it to be regulated at the level of the nation. I was wondering if I might ask you a question that's more relevant to ECRs, to those who might just be starting out in trying to study these topics. It seems to me, Nora, that just from my own limited experience of doing research on social media data, is it can be challenging to convey the significance of social media data to those in health or in policy, right? Sometimes it's viewed as being perhaps only tangentially or even not related to health, like it not being solid enough as a data source. And there are challenges associated with both data collection, the methodologies of analyzing it, and then almost like presenting it in a way that's relevant to health audiences. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I do feel like there's a growing awareness of this issue in public health, but it feels that we are playing a huge game of catch up, right? Like we're 20 years behind where other fields are in terms of understanding this landscape and the actors and the mechanisms by which things pick up and spread. I think that when it comes to public health institutions in particular, they are really behind on this stuff. And or blatantly kind of techno-optimistic, which makes it really hard to both get the funding that you need for the research as well as to influence the kind of policy-making levers. So my colleague Meg Davis, who's been doing some really fascinating work in Geneva with the ways that youth activists use digital media in the global health space. She pointed out to me this week that the global strategy on digital health for 2020 to 2025 from the World Health Organization doesn't mention social media.
Wow. Wow.
And it's still using language like the digital divide, right? Which we know from other scholars that we're not in a space of digital divide. There's huge complexities to the ways that people interact with and access and navigate these complex digital terrains. So I think we have a lot of catch-up work to do. And I think that more recently it's become very, I don't know, kind of sexy to do like, social media research if you're like a doctor. But I worry that people who are kind of jumping into this field now because it's more popular are not sort of um, immersing themselves in the very lengthy scholarship that has been already done by people outside of public health and medical fields, but that's really valuable and really important for us to understand fully kind of like what we're getting into. So I think it's all the more important that we engage in that kind of cross-disciplinary scholarship as we try and kind of catch up the time that we've lost.
Well, just on that point, Nora, I thought I'd try and dig in a little bit deeper, because it seems to me that one of the challenges with conducting research on social media companies is that we're often in a way reliant on the consent of these companies to obtain the required data. And that can be very problematic when we're trying to deal with areas where there might be a conflict of interest, or the company might end up looking bad as a result of research that we do. And on the flip side, there's the question of how we deal with research that's funded by social media companies or conducted in partnership with social media companies, and with wider corporate social responsibility initiatives that are led by social media companies, how we should evaluate them or think about them. I was wondering if you might be able to reflect on that for us.
Yeah, I think it's hugely problematic that a lot of the research funding for these kinds of projects is coming from industry. And I'll just be really blunt. I think it was like maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I was kind of starting with this crowdfunding research. I was really interested in expanding the geographic frame of what I was looking at to look at how people were using crowdfunding in Southern and Eastern Africa. And I actually got approached by Facebook's social research arm, and they offered me a lot of money to do basically what I wanted. And I ultimately ended up turning down the grant that they offered me. And thank God I'm in a place where I'm not tied to grants, and so I have the power to do that. But it was very appealing. It was very hard, to not say yes to a kind of, grant with very few strings attached. But it became clear to me that they were very interested in my research for marketing purposes and in order to expand markets in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think we need a lot more rules for transparency with researchers in terms of where they're getting their money from and what the kind of bounds are on what they can do with it. So if you look at like Facebook's Data for Good project, or even the kind of Twitter data sharing projects that they have for researchers, they control what you get, and they control the terms of how you get it. And I think that they have a really strong stranglehold over what kinds of research is possible with the data that they are granting access to. But I think Marco's thought about this even more than I have, because he's often trying to get data from these platforms directly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to it, right? And there's been a couple news stories in the past, maybe like a couple of years as well, about Facebook, for example, intervening on researchers trying to scrape data. Out of NYU, there's quite a big story that came out of that. And it just speaks to, I guess the question is, the data that they make available, why do they make only that data available versus kind of this black box that we've been talking about of maybe the stuff that we want to see a bit more. So for example, in my research, one of the things I'm really interested about is how Facebook or Meta or any social media platform uses its targeting tools. So how does it generate the interest that they target to users? And how can advertisers use that data or use these interests and targeting tools to get to specific people? But if I want to research that, I generally can't. And in some cases where I can, it's for a social or political cause. But even then, I'm kind of only able to get these very basic kind of data, which would be like gender, age, maybe like the states or province somebody lives in, how much they spend, things like that. But in reality, there's a lot of complex targeting that's going on behind the scenes there. And if you look as well, you can kind of get like a little audience feature sometimes for specific advertisers who they've targeted in the last 90 days. But that kind of data that you get, you really can't do research on. It's more of like a one standalone thing that you can say. So there's this image that, we're making this data available, but if you're actually studying using these tools or studying these tools, I think you could argue, this data isn't available. It's available enough to say that data is available versus doing something so meaningful with it. I'm not sure if Nora agrees with that, but that's kind of been my experience.
No, I totally do. And I think also, anytime you're accessing this data, you're running a liability risk for yourself, right? It feels very vulnerable. And I'm not unaccustomed to other kinds of legal vulnerabilities when doing commercial health research, but it feels particularly so in this space, in part because the law is not very well established. There have been cases before the Supreme Court and other courts in the US just in the last couple of years about the rights of researchers to scrape data, for example. So it feels very, very legally unsettled. And it also feels as if these corporations have a great deal to protect when it comes to their data, because their data is one of their most valuable commodities.
Wow, what a fascinating set of reflections. It strikes me, just thinking back through the topics we've covered so far, that we're looking at a range of power imbalances here. There's the power imbalance between the researchers seeking to do research on social media platforms and what social media platforms are willing to share in terms of data. There's the power imbalance between what regulators and the public might know about the algorithms and the sources of the majority of profits for these companies and what the companies know themselves. There are power imbalances between the advertisers and the millions of underage social media users who are exposed to potentially harmful ads, right? So it strikes me that there is a lot of research potentially to do in this area, but that we're currently only really scratching the surface. At the same time, it seems like that surface might become increasingly resistant to penetration, that there is a danger that these companies may become even less transparent, especially if they feel that the release of further data in transparent ways might be used against them in terms of regulation. And I was just wondering what you feel a forward-looking agenda might be for this field to overcome some of those challenges and dig beneath the surface of these companies.
I was just going to say quickly, I think that's kind of a question that we all have, but I don't know if there's an answer to. I think for me, some of the immediate things is kind of to demand transparency a bit more. I think there's this idea that because of this techno-optimism and these social media companies are good actors that just have this problem, but there's this good faith basis that they'll address it. I think we kind of have to shift away from that. I think we're at the point now where having external standards for social media companies versus kind of relying on their own self-regulation is one of the things that I would advocate for. I think we're at that point now where I think enough has been said and we've seen enough of the inner working of these companies and how they inequitably enforce their policies on certain populations, how they don't for other parts of the world. And I think I think there's been enough kind of pulled from that curtain that warrants that maybe we shouldn't have this good faith kind of view, maybe.
Margot, I think you're totally right. Like, so much of the research that we've all kind of gotten trapped into doing is actually like regulation research, right? Like, we're kind of filling the place of regulations that don't exist because no one else is doing it. So, at least in my crowdfunding research, like, I'm not a big data scientist. I'm lucky to work with some, but this is not what I want to be doing, right? Like, I don't want to be like trying to figure out like whose campaigns get deleted from GoFundMe. Like, that's like a public question that should be obvious and should be accessible to all of us. And I think if we were freed up from doing some of that incredibly labor and resource intensive sort of watchdog research, then we could do much more interesting things with our time. So for example, I think that there's a huge need for more kind of insider ethnographies of a lot of these corporations, of people who are working there. A lot of the most valuable information that we've gotten about tech corporations in the last couple of years has come from whistleblowers. So I think that kind of insider ethnography, corporate ethnography, could be incredibly powerful for uncovering things that we haven't even thought to ask yet. But similarly, I'm equally interested in more user-oriented studies of what the kind of lived experience of these platforms is for diverse people, in particular, people who are struggling with complex health needs, or kind of trying to navigate these digital environments to get what they need to survive. And I think we've kind of lost sight of the kind of human face of this because we've been so focused on these absolutely important questions, but questions that governments could easily answer if they just demanded the data.
Thank you so much for reflecting on this with me. I find this a really fascinating conversation. One thing that strikes me that's a little bit unique about social media is the fact that every experience is very individually tailored. So the things that I'll see when I log on to Facebook or Twitter are very, very different to what you might see. In a way, it's my own little microenvironment. And that's, of course, one of the benefits of social media, right? You're exposed to this environment that's very much tailored to you, to your preferences, your past likes, your networks, your colleagues, etc. The downside, of course, and I'm thinking especially of young people here, is that where those environments become negative or toxic or dark in various ways, they are, again, environments that have to sort of be navigated or experienced sometimes alone because other people don't necessarily see what you're seeing or know what it is that you're seeing. And perhaps it's just me being a little bit old-fashioned, but I do worry about the life course effects of some of these exposures over time. And I wonder, and maybe you could reflect on this with me, do you feel we'll look back at this time as sort of the wild, wild west, when these companies were allowed a huge amount of leeway with a huge audience that was overexposed in ways that were highly underregulated? Or do you think we'll look back at this as us sort of accepting that social media in the way that it's currently constructed and operated is just now a part of the human experience, and it's something that children and young people, as they're growing up, just have to become accustomed to navigating?
It's a big question. Yeah, I think when we look back, it's gonna look like a time of a bit Wild West. So a lot of the stuff I do is around misinformation. And I think a lot of people, when they think of misinformation, they think of just people saying the wrong things online, for example. But anyway, that's a whole problem on its own. But the reality is, like, you can advertise misinformation and there's little barriers to it at all. And sometimes this misinformation can be on important things like an election, it could be on people's health needs, it could be on just basic decency kind of items that would affect a lot of people in the world. I do think too, when we look back on how these tools can be so tailored individually to people, I think that's my biggest, the worrisome piece to me. People can be radicalized on these platforms. They can be kind of influenced into make decisions that are not in their interests. But a lot of times as well, these kind of decisions, though, it's not just seeing social media platforms, it's people who tailor the message to them so they see it, so they'll do a certain thing. And I still don't think we're ready to unpack the impact of this targeted kind of ads to these very specific people and what that's done. It can influence elections, which can change the world. And I still think we're coming to the gravity of that.
Yeah, I think it's almost an unanswerable question right now. But I do wonder about what future us will kind of say about this moment in time. And I wonder if we'll say, God, we were so naive. Here we were talking about these things as if they were bad unintended outcomes of good platforms, rather than exactly the way that they were built and exactly the way that they were intended to be by the kind of corporate titans of the digital world. I think if you look at their intentions, at the kind of philosophies that they ascribe themselves to, they are anti-government. They want to govern themselves. They want algorithms to govern our behavior, and our consumption. I look at something like Facebook's Supreme Court, and it just chills me to the core, because that's not a governance plan for Facebook. That's a vision of how Facebook wants governance to be in the future for all of us, right? And I think similarly, if you look at like GoFundMe, like they say very explicitly, we want to be the place where people give. That's their ambition, is to be like the place, if you're going to make a charitable or philanthropic contribution, that they are the arbiter of where that goes in and where that comes out. And they've said quite clearly that they think that, they're going to kind of ultimately do away with nonprofits, right? And so there's this real intentionality. I think there's a real imagined future sort of governance aspect to all of these corporations that goes well beyond the corporations themselves, to a kind of future vision of society that I find fairly chilling.
Wow, Nora, yes. What a note to end it on. This whole conversation reminds me a little bit of that story at the start of that famous speech by David Foster Wallace. I'm sure you've heard of it, about these two young fish swimming along in the water, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and says, "What the hell's water?" And I think, in a way, social media has become the water where we don't even acknowledge what's in it, or how it's shaped, what incentives are in it, and how they might be shaping us, our interactions, our relationships, our priorities. And I think just having more of these conversations where we explicitly acknowledge the role of these for-profit companies, their incentives, and some of the challenges that poses are really interesting. Thank you so much to both of you for coming on the podcast, sharing your expertise with us. I hope you have a great day and wish you the best of luck in your future research and action. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Nathan.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you for joining me on another episode of Money, Power, Health. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please do consider giving it a rating on whatever podcast app you're using. That really helps get it in front of more people and allow them to also engage with the podcast. If you enjoyed the music on this podcast, it was recorded and composed by my brother Daniel Manny, who is an extremely talented musician and poet. I'll leave a link to some of his content in the show notes for you to see. And I'll also leave a link to papers by Nora and Marco dealing with social media as a commercial determinant of health, for those of you who are interested in exploring it more. I will see you in the next episode. So in the meantime, thank you again for listening and take care.